paired cables are formed when two cables are formed directly adjacent to one another. In this example, there are two 2x2 cables formed across a span of 8 adjacent needles together. So here's 1, 2, 1, 2. Together, these two cables form a pair. As with single cables, the direction in which we twist the cables will impact the way the cables appear from the knit side of the work. Here in this example on the right, the cable is always crossed in the same direction. This forms the traditional cable, or one that appears to be twisted. The cable on the left alternates the direction of the twist or the cross in every instance of the cable, forming a singular ridge that's always on the top side of the cable. If we compare the single cable with the paired cable, you can see that the pairs mirror one another to achieve, in this example, this kind of wishbone effect. On the other side, we can see this ridge formed by alternating the cross in every instance of the cable, and how together, when paired and mirrored across the center of the paired cable, it will create this circular open work effect on top. In practice, working this wishbone cable across 8 needles in the instance of a 2x2 paired cable, I'm always going to form the cables in the same direction. So forming them out from the center of the paired cable as the first step. So here in my needle setup, I've got 8 stitches isolated between 2 columns of purl stitches, and I'm picking up the first cable and moving in the first step out away from the center of the paired cable and depositing those stitches, and then replacing the empty needles with the other leg of the cable in a sense. Across the center of the paired cable, I'm essentially doing the same thing, but the mirrored version of it, so to speak. So I'm picking up both legs of the cable, and in the first step, moving the leg out away from the center of the work, depositing those stitches on the needles, and then replacing the last 2 remaining empty needles with the other leg. This is crossing the cable. Because there's quite a bit of tension on these needles, I want to knit back from hold or from forward working position to ensure that my needles knit off cleanly. So here you can see that those center needles are touching or nearly touching when they're brought to hold. I'm going to pull these back to forward working position to separate those needles a bit and prevent the chance of them connecting or tangling up when I pass the carriage across. I'm knitting 6 rows in between each instance of crossing the paired cable. So we can see from the back of the work that in this example, I've moved out and then in to form this wishbone paired cable. And I'm going to repeat that step in the next instance of the cable, which is here 6 rows later. So moving each group out and then in on both sides of the center of the paired cable. Here's a closer view of the purl side. Again, you can see that the first step I've moved out, and then in the second step I've moved in. On the purl side of the work, though, because we're seeing the last cross, we're seeing that second leg cross inward. But because we're going to look at the knit side when the cable is finished, we'll see those cables cross out away from the center of the work. Again, this wishbone cable is formed by repeating the same steps in every instance of the cable cross. Here in a second, you'll see that I've made a mistake here, and when I've put down that first outward cable, I pulled the needles too far out, and those stitches have gone behind the latch. I have to either redeposit them in the hooks before I can draw the needles back, or try to very carefully work around them to avoid anything from hopping off the needle and having my stitches run. So here, if we take a peek at the knit side of the work, you can see those cables forming that wishbone effect because we're always crossing them in the same direction. In the other variation of paired cables, I'm alternating the direction in which I'm twisting the cables every other instance of the cable cross. So here it's keeping that ridge on top of the cable, forming this X's and O's type pattern as we work up the cable. So in this last instance, I've crossed out, then in, and in the next instance of the cable, I'm gonna do the opposite and work in and then out. So here from the purl side, we can see that those cable twists are alternating direction. This is again keeping that ridge consistently on the top of the cable on the knit side. I haven't been showing this, but I've been reforming stitches on either side to help the cable appear more pronounced from the knit side of the work. Okay, in the last instance, we moved in then out. So here we're gonna switch and move out, then in. So out, away from the center, and then replacing those two empty needles in with the other leg of the cable. Six rows later, I'm going to do the opposite. So I moved out from the center, and now I'll move in towards the center. From the knit side, we can see that cabled ridge always on top of the cable, forming that circular open work effect.